Some meditation teachings say you're not a person, but you're the awareness that experiences a person and world. Or you're not the doer or enjoyer of things, you're the witness. Today I'm going to explain what that is. One thing before I start, the awareness approach is not for everyone. It challenges some basic intuitions, and not everybody wants to do that. And that's totally fine. This is just one of multiple paths that lead to meditative insight. That said, I do find this approach very effective personally at creating positive shifts in experience, and what may seem strange at first will hopefully by the end of the video make more sense or even seem obviously true. Okay, so the idea here is that the real experiencer of this conscious experience is not a person or mind, but it is impersonal awareness, a basic knowingness without any real properties or qualities except that it effortlessly experiences the present moment. To help get a feel for this, I'm going to explain what experience is like from the perspective of impersonal awareness, which I sometimes just call awareness. Take a look at this drawing. Let's take this to represent visual experience. There is a dog, part of a house, the front part of legs, part of an arm, and this nose eyebrow thing. If you close one of your eyes, you can see the nose eyebrow in real life, but it is a lot blurrier. Okay, so now ordinarily it feels like this visual experience is organized into two categories. The you stuff, these body appearances, and not you, which is everything else. From the perspective of awareness, though, there is no such distinction. There's just visual stuff. There's no special relationship of identity, control, or possession between awareness and any particular contents of the visual field. As an analogy, consider a monitor displaying a first-person shooter. We see the player character's hands, a gun, environment, HUD, and so on. From the perspective of the monitor, is there something special about the pixels that display the player character's hands? No, they're just pixels like any other. Same thing here. Everything is just experience within awareness. As it turns out, this applies to all other types of experience as well. Thoughts, emotions, other perceptions, feelings of attention or control. From the perspective of awareness, these have equal status as the visual experience of a building. There's no special relationship of control, possession, or identity between awareness and any of these particular contents. It may be true that certain types of experience are experienced more frequently than others or in certain patterns or combinations, but from the perspective of awareness, that doesn't give them a special status. That just means they're experienced more often or in certain patterns. Now, how might somebody who disagrees with what I'm saying respond? They might say, actually, awareness isn't the experiencer of this moment. I'm the experiencer. I am a person with a mind and body, and those things that you earlier called body appearances, that's my body. And it does have a special relationship to the experiencer because it's mine, just like my thoughts and my emotions. From the perspective of awareness, that whole reply is experiential content, which is experienced by awareness, and then very quickly disappears and gets replaced with another experience, which then quickly disappears, and so on. It's like frames in a movie. There's one frame, that frame disappears without remainder, and a new frame replaces it, which then disappears without remainder, and so on and so on. So in a way, I have dissolved the argument. This is a different way of experiencing thoughts. But in all seriousness, there does seem to be something here that calls for explanation. If, from a phenomenological perspective, it's true that awareness has no special relation to any of its contents, then why does it so often experience these human first-person perspective experiences? The thoughts, the emotions, the perceptions of a body. Why doesn't it experience something totally random or non-human? To answer this, let's stop talking about awareness for a moment and think about organisms. As organisms evolve to be more complex and intelligent, it's increasingly in their interest to create inner models of their surroundings. Models are useful. Think of in chemistry when they say, let's assume that this is an ideal gas, and how that makes the calculations easier without much penalty. You could also say that all programming languages are useful simplified models of what happens at a hardware level. So models are useful. How does the human organism create a model of its surroundings? Well, first, its senses take in information from the external world. This is limited because they can only detect certain things. That raw sensory information is kind of chaotic, and so it gets further processed. Some of the noise gets ignored, some patterns are identified. And on one way of looking at it, the end result of that is used to generate a simulated world, a virtual world. What is that virtual world? It is what we normally assume is the external world. It is the world of your experience. It's all you've ever experienced of a supposed external world. So when you consciously look at an object, you're actually experiencing this inner simulation of a world. This part is a little tricky to fully grasp at first. One thing that helps me is to imagine the following. Let's say that there's an object and there's animals of different species perceiving that same object. So like a bat, a dolphin, cat, whatever. And if we grant that each animal has an image of that object, image defined in a very broad sense, then that image is going to be different for each animal. Why? Because their sense organs are different and their brains are different. But what does that say about your experience of an object? It's also relative to your sense organs in your brain. That means what you experience when you experience an external object is not the object itself, but it is this internal mental representation. It's like mental imagery, experiential content. That's what you're really experiencing when you think you're experiencing the world. Okay, now, the human organism also wants to simulate itself. What is the simulated person? Well, that is the person of conscious experience, the perception of body parts, the conscious experience of thoughts and emotions. That is the virtual person. How is that a simplification? Well, if you look up what's involved in like moving your arm or balancing yourself, it's actually really complicated at like a muscular, neurological, cellular level, and yet none of that's experienced. There's a lot of unconscious brain activity involved in thinking, and yet none of that's experienced. So what is put in the virtual person is just very top level, like skimming off the top of what's happening. Okay, now, it's not going to work if the virtual person and the virtual world are isolated, because the whole point of this model is to see how well the person is faring in their environment. That means that the virtual person and the virtual world need to be within the same space, or they need to be experienced within the same medium. What is that shared medium where we see both the virtual person and the virtual world? Impersonal awareness. That basic ground consciousness is the perceiver of the virtual person and the virtual world. Now, when I'm talking about awareness here, we don't need to believe that it's some weird metaphysical thing. You can just think of this in naturalistic terms as something used by the organism as the sort of apprehender of the model or the displayer of the joint person world model. And maybe you can finally see that what may have seemed strange at the start of the video actually would be the phenomenological description of things from the point of view of awareness. So it actually kind of makes sense. Now, maybe you can see that now. And actually, from the point of view of this awareness, there is no ultimate difference between the virtual person and the virtual world. They're so intermingled with each other, and they're both just experiential content. Okay, now, how does the human organism use this model? Well, think of this analogy. Imagine that there's some big, in the distant future, there's some big space battle. There's a bunch of spaceships fighting each other. Maybe there's different planets and solar systems involved. It's very complicated. Are these strategists on one side peering through the windows of their spaceships, and then based on what they can make out, that's how they decide what they want to do next? No. They're looking at some digital map, a digital display of what's happening, and then which multiple strategy people have access to, and then based on that, they collaboratively decide what the next move should be. In the same way, speculatively, we could say that the virtual person world thing is accessed by multiple modules of the unconscious brain. And then using that information as well as other information they have access to, they collaboratively decide what they want the next thought or action of the organism to be. Then the organism does that thought or action. The model is updated through the senses and through interoception, and then the unconscious modules of the brain make their new decision, and so the cycle keeps on happening in real time. We can think of this as how consciousness is used by the organism. What does all this have to do with meditation and non-duality? It seems like the virtual person model, which, to be clear, is just consciousness. I'm talking about subjective conscious experience here. It seems like it can be experienced in at least two ways. One is from the perspective of the virtual person identifying as both the experiencer and as the controller of its thoughts and actions. Another way is that it can be experienced from the perspective of impersonal awareness. And this is a little complicated because there's different meditation approaches and different aspects of realizing non-duality and whatnot. But to overly simplify things, what happens when you meditate or do other skillful means of realizing non-duality is the default way of experiencing gets replaced with experiencing from the perspective of awareness. Okay, now, why would somebody want to do this? Why would somebody want to make this big change in the nature of their experience? There's two reasons. The first is it's very nice. Like, just speaking for myself, when I'm experiencing from awareness, it's very pleasant. It's like everything is just happening on its own. Everything's kind of connected. It's a very nice way of experiencing, I find. It's very automatic, it's like a non-volitional way of living. And the other reason is that, as you've probably noticed, there's something very wrong or false about the default way of experiencing. Because one, the virtual person is not the experiencer of this experience. It's impersonal awareness, which experiences both the virtual person and the virtual world. And two, the virtual person also isn't the controller of its actions. Its thoughts and actions are being determined largely by these unconscious processes. So, again, this is controversial, but one aspect, at least, of enlightenment could be that shift from the virtual person identity to the to the impersonal awareness identity, and this can be viewed as a movement from a false, ignorant position to one which is more in line with reality. Okay, now 2 quick things before I wrap up the video. The first is, I don't want to give the impression that there is a you here, which then first identifies as the virtual person and then it identifies as awareness. There is no you. Any sense of a you is just the virtual person. So when that shift is made, it's like an empty room perceiving things. There's like empty space. There's no experiencer which occupies the impersonal awareness. They're just impersonal awareness. And the second thing is, on the account of how consciousness is used by the organism, which is speculative, consciousness is not an epiphenomena. In other words, it's not just some thing which serves no function. It serves a very useful function because it's used by these modules to efficiently make decisions by these parts of the brain. And the same way that the digital map is used by those strategy people in the sci-fi scenario. Okay, and one last thing, this entire video is just contents which exist within the field of awareness and then quickly disappear and get replaced by something else.